We're pretty much at the limit of borrowing at the moment.
You are supposed to be the servants of the people. The people are supposed to be your bosses. And to me, the people doesn't even realize that.
Good evening. My name is Ralph from St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
I'm going to say something that's controversial. CARICOM has gotten in its own way.
I want to be very clear that there is a dangerous tendency in our country.
This program is talk about the facts. We must bring the facts.
Time to face the facts.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. One of the most important issues in the Caribbean region and certainly right across the world is the system of governance, what is in place to manage our societies and the way that is managed by those who sit in the various offices. On this edition of the program, we are going to be looking at the importance of opposition voices to our democracy. And we have two people that you will be very excited to listen to, and I will introduce them to you, or rather have them introduce themselves to you when we return. Don't go away, we'll be right back.
Men are not made to physically abuse women.
It's something that has become a serious problem in our country, or has been a serious problem in our country. Abuse could present itself in many forms. It could be physical, verbal or emotional, and the most egregious, sexual.
It's not a good look. It's not right in no form. So domestic violence against women should stop. How can you hit a woman, beat a woman?
Every form of abuse has an effect on the individual abuse, on their family members, on children, even the community as a whole.
I'm a man. I came out of a woman. I love my mother. I love my nieces. So to the children, if you're being abused, talk to somebody that you trust and get your message to the person.
This has been a message from the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment in collaboration with its social partners. If you or anyone you know is in need of help, please feel free to contact us at 440-2269. And remember, a life free from violence is possible.
Feel good facts.
Help prevent cold and flu by washing your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. That's the time it takes to remove most germs. No soap and water? No worries when you've got alcohol-based hand sanitizer.
Welcome back to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. As I mentioned when we went out on the break, we are going to be looking at opposition voices. How important are they to democracy? And to help me discuss that topic, we have two very eminent gentlemen, well known across the region. They hardly need any introduction, but I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Anyway, beginning with the gentleman from St. Kitts.
Hello, thank you for having me on your program, Time to Face the Facts. I am Denzel Douglas of St. Kitts and Nevis. Presently, I'm the leader of the opposition in Parliament, leader of the St. Kitts and Nevis Labour Party, and of course, former Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis from 1995 to 2015. Thanks for having me with you today.
You are very welcome. And the other gentleman, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on Time to Face the Facts. It's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Douglas, and pleasant time to be here too with your viewers all over the region. I'm Patrick Antoine. I am the chairman of Grenada Movement. It's a newly formed public policy NGO dealing with public policy issues in Grenada and the region as it impacts the Grenadian people. Properly contextualized, it is in fact a pressure group, and is intended to be a pressure group aimed at trying to nudge government in the direction of adopting appropriate policies for the country in the Grenada context where there is no parliamentary opposition, which is important.
Thank you very much. And I am glad you mentioned parliamentary opposition, because I want to go straight to Dr. Douglas with this question. Dr. Douglas, you served as Prime Minister of St. Kitts for a long time, as you just said in your introduction. And while you were sitting in the seat of Prime Minister, managing the affairs of the government, what did you think of opposition voices at the time?
Well, of course, I always knew that the opposition voice was important. Our Constitution basically outlines that there is a role for the opposition in our democracy. You do have in the parliament, for example, although it is a unicameral system, we do have in the parliament, the government elected representatives or senators who are appointed, and the opposition members elected, as well as senators as appointed according to the Constitution. And the Constitution definitely outlines a specific role and function of the opposition. In fact, apart from the role and responsibilities, one can even suggest that there are certain entitlements of the opposition. And in government, I respected that view, and today in opposition, I am also strongly of that view. In fact, I should add that when I started out my parliamentary life back in 1989, I was in the opposition, and from there went on into government, and now back in the opposition. So I understand the critical role that the opposition has to play.
And just to make it clear, when we speak of opposition here, I am not only speaking of an opposition sitting in the parliament. I'm speaking of opposition voices in general, as Dr. Antoine spoke about his group, which he recently put together, the TGM. It's a pressure group which seeks to influence policy and raise awareness about the rights, really, of citizens of the country in a way that a sitting government would not possibly. So when we think of opposition, not just opposition in parliament. And as a matter of fact, the kind of opposition we have in parliament is really a kind of bastardized system, because our constitutions do not really recognize political parties as such, but somehow we have created that party system and inserted it into our culture. And that is what most of our, not most, that is what our countries live by throughout the Caribbean. So this kind of party system, and I want Dr. Antoine to weigh in on this as well. This kind of party system, Dr. Douglas, do you think it serves our country well in the system of governance?
Well, if I could jump in fairly quickly, let me just say that I endorse what Dr. Douglas said at the beginning in relation to the way in which our parties operate in a context of governance. I also know that from a previous dispensation that Dr. Douglas himself was there when we tried to give voice, inclusion to opposition voices in the context of civil society. And I want to say that particularly in relation to the OECS, and I'm going to make three distinctions. One is the national level. One is the sub-regional level, which many people forget is extremely important for us. because we in fact have a revised Treaty of Basseterre, which of course binds us in the OECS in a number of very fundamental ways, often not spoken about until someone challenges it in the court. We then also have a revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which speaks to a number of arrangements that are important to our existentiality as a Caribbean civilization in relation to rights. Let's get back to the national space. In the national space, I think we are facing, in fact, a crisis of construction. The crisis of construction comes from the way in which I believe we have inherited the Westminster model, and we have done a few creative things with it. So our parliamentary system has now run its course, I believe, in its present form. We see that happening in Barbados and Grenada, in a number of other countries, where what you're seeing now is that on the first past the post, what you have is that the winner takes all. You have now solutions where one party ends up with all the seats. Now, how does that, as it were, compare with this model of democracy that Dr. Douglas very properly spoke about? Well, this model, which speaks about the bicameral system, the upper house, the lower house, really is aimed at trying to ensure that this principle that we call democracy, which is based on sovereignty of the individual, which is based on the powers of the state and separation, is really aimed at ensuring that we don't have a system where the majority runs, as it were, rampant over the minority. Democracy is really important and fundamental, particularly for minorities in a structure such as ours. So the system really was intended to ensure that both the majority and the minority in a context of party politics coming from the polls actually have a voice. What happens when we have one party winning all the seats is that oftentimes, if there are no other avenues existing, you have a domination of important minority segments in the population by the majority. And what happens in our system really is that the majority need not be that large. The majority only need be one party that has narrowly won the seats in every single constituency. So you're likely to have a situation where, let us say 53% of the population is dominant over the other 47%. And I think that is really the model of construction that I'm talking about, because we haven't created the avenues for full inclusion at the national level. And increasingly, we're running into a number of difficulties where important segments of the population, such as women, such as youth, such as the elderly, are finding themselves voiceless. And so what we have is that increasingly, a number of these segments are beginning to look for alternative forms of expression. And I dare say, in the case of youth, a lot of that expression, if we're not careful, if it's not managed, will find its way on the street. In the context of the OECS, we haven't done well either, because although we've spoken about in the context of the OECS, the assembly, which is supposed to include opposition parties, it does not function well. And where it does function, whenever there is a meeting, what happens is that the agenda is managed. And also within the context of CARICOM, I think we're starting to find that the voices that are not at the table are beginning themselves to demand that their voice be heard. So you have the CARICOM private sector organization, you have the labor unions now are seated at the table. In all of these three models, there is a fundamental issue. The issue is information. I'll let Dr. Douglas go on from here, but until these parties, both those that are not included are given a voice, those that are unincluded, that are included partially, right, are given information, and those that really are at the table, yes, so they're there and they're seated, are given the infrastructure and the information, we're not going to have a truly functional democracy in the context of the Caribbean in the 21st century, as we have to exist now in a global environment which is increasingly hostile. And that's the problem.
Yes, and I certainly want to hear Dr. Douglas weigh in on this, because what you have described and the way the system functions, Dr. Antoine, it's a direct result of the kind of party system that we have, which does not truly reflect the Westminster system, which we claim to have inherited and which we claim to use. So your analysis and your thoughts on that, Dr. Douglas, especially coming from you in particular, who have been on both sides of the House.
Definitely, I think Dr. Antoine is correct. To a large extent, I outlined what would be the role of the parliamentary opposition. But in terms of having the voices of those who are essential groups and stakeholders in the building of our society generally and of our country, the stakeholders who make a contribution, those who are of the private sector, those who are of the NGO groups, the church, the youth voices, etc., they need to be represented. And to a large extent, even within the parliamentary opposition, sometimes the opportunity to represent these groups is very much stifled. And whether it is the informal arrangement where there is no parliamentary representative who is speaking for the opposition parties or voice, or there is the formal representation of individuals and residents in constituencies, we definitely have to ensure that at the end of the day, they are delivering what we expect of them in support of the progress of our governance system in our democracy, and that is to ensure that their voices are heard, their specific concerns and issues are ventilated at the highest level, if not in the parliament, definitely by way of the media, by way of the sounding brass that is out there on the streets. We believe very, very strongly that their voices need to be heard, especially if they are not represented in the parliament. And to a large extent, if the government is serious in terms of having representation of all of the persons, those who may be supporters of the government and those who may not, it is the government's duty, it is the government's responsibility to ensure that that voice, those voices of opposition are heard, so that that voice, those expressions, those suggestions and ideas can invigorate the discussions that the government representatives are having on behalf of the people of the countries that they are representing. So you have to have that voice, irrespective of how it is obtained.
But let me ask, of course, both yourself and Dr. Antoine this question. I'm going back to it. Do you gentlemen, from your observation and experiences and participation, believe that the type of party system that we have and practice, do they contribute to or take away from opposition voices and opposition groups having a place at that table and to have their concerns taken on board? Dr. Douglas, you go first.
Well, I would say from my own experience, having had it both ways, there are times when the government is deaf to the voices of the opposition, even within the parliamentary opposition setting. Governments, to some extent, practice the type of governance where the voice of the opposition, if one is not careful, is stifled, and deliberately so. And there are glaring examples that we are having here in the Caribbean at this very moment, when we are looking at the aftermath and the continuing challenges that we're facing from the COVID-19 pandemic, where a government may say that its approach to the management of the COVID-19 pandemic is as a result of consultation with all stakeholders. They use the expression all society approach. But here in St. Kitts and Nevis, even when the opposition is present in the parliament, the government has had no consultation whatsoever with the opposition until it was forced to do so because of its failed policy and program with regard to the vaccination program that is ongoing. In fact, the government of the day introduced a state of emergency, deliberately so, when an election was called, so that our voices in the opposition were not heard, where we were locked out and locked down, while the government ministers were out there participating in the usual election campaigning exercises. This is the kind of demonstration of goodwill or distraction from goodwill of the government with regard to the opposition voices. Even though, as I said, there is a legitimacy for our voices to be heard in the parliament. But when the parliament is not really functioning as such, because we're in a lockdown, and the bill is passed that introduces a state of emergency where our voice is not heard, where it is difficult for us to go out into public spaces and speak our views on the management of the pandemic, then the government still says it is having an all of society approach, which is absolute nonsense.
Antoine, what type of impact do you see the party system having on the concerns and demands of opposition voices in the society?
Yeah, well, the problems of construction that I mentioned earlier, that Dr. Douglas just elaborated on, I think the discussion is really interesting because he's actually given us a perspective of when the opposition is in parliament. I want to then juxtapose that against the context in Grenada where the opposition party is not in parliament. And therefore, when the opposition party is not in parliament, I think the problems are exacerbated from two perspectives. You have no one to represent, as it were. Yes, we understand that government should be for all the people. Yes, because it's by the people, but I just sort of discussed with you that by the people could mean in the context of the model that we have, right, a very narrow majority in every single constituency. And so where the opposition is not in the parliament, and you have this problem exacerbated, the real issue for me goes to the core of democracy. Who speaks for the people? Who speaks for the people? And this is why I say there's a problem of construction, because certainly where you don't have the parliamentary opposition, right, effective and active, right, what happens is that given the system that we have, which unfortunately now lags by miles behind the system in the countries that we borrowed it from. In the UK, for instance, you have, constitutionally and, by laws and also by convention, and I'm, for those purists, I'm admitting that the UK Constitution has arisen by convention. I'm not just saying it was by law and it was drafted and so on. We're together. But people have gotten voices, and so you have facilities and you have institutional arrangements that must be followed, for instance, before policy is adopted. In our country, where there is no parliamentary opposition, that is not the case. So what you have is that you have, once you've given your assent at the voting station, from that moment on, you have lost any kind of connectivity with the act of what decision is taken, because there are no infrastructures put in place to ensure that, yes, the Senate is there to debate, but where the government has a majority or an absolute majority, as in the case with Grenada, then of course you know what the outcome is. And so the second issue is that we've seen recently in Grenada a move by one of the persons who won on the government slate to the opposition bench. But I think if you were to listen to his utterances in the press, that he gets the documents late, that he doesn't have the information to make proper submissions, that questions remain unanswered. And of course, time after time, what happens is that he's outvoted, even when he is the lone voice, yes, of those who would see themselves as having a one shoe-in the parliament. Then of course, again, it raises these issues. And for me, there are three issues. One, is that we need to talk about how we reform this model urgently. Secondly, we need to talk about, okay, how do we make sure that government decisions and the actions by the government and its intended actions are actually supported at the ground and at the community level, particularly to give the people a voice. And I'm very clear, I have been clear for years, that we need to enact local government legislation. It is important for democracy. The third thing is, how do we ensure that, that these corner solutions that we're talking about do not keep happening over and over again, which is deleterious to our democratic system. And finally, we need to make a distinction here between the desire of people to be governed. And all of what we're talking about is really about government in its purest form. And Dr. Douglas has made his very, very good contributions on what happens even when the model appears to work prima facie. I'm arguing that there is a fundamental difference between being governed and being ruled. And in many of the countries now, you get a sense that you're being ruled. You get a sense when, for instance, you listen to the decisions and the decrees from government, that we've gone even further back than when you inherited these models. We've gone back almost to what we thought was an evolutionary process from the absolute right of monarchs and kings. And that is what happens where you don't have an effectual system of ensuring that you have links with the people and that the people have a voice in the democratic structure. And that is what I think we now need to work on. We know some of the problems, we need to work on it, albeit the case that we'll have to do so while we try to see how we can find avenues and windows into the corridors of influence based on how it is now structured.
Dr. Anton, that is almost a perfect note, if there ever was one, to take this break on. So we're going to go take a sip of water, and we will be right back to continue this very interesting and I would say very exciting discussion on opposition voices and their importance to our democracy. Don't go away, viewers. We're going to be right back.
I remember when this beach was really wide, a place to picnic and play cricket.
And we used to go up to the end to get away from all the people. Now all the beach gone.
Coastal erosion. When the sea starts to come in and take the land away, everyone loses something.
Granny, look how the waves are washing right under that house.
Coastal erosion. It's a hazard. Hazards. Take control. Reduce your loss. What can you do to help stop coastal erosion? For one, don't drive four-wheel vehicles on seaside dunes. They loosen sand and destroy binding vegetation, causing erosion. Find out more about coastal erosion and other hazards at your local disaster office.
A message from the National Disaster Management Agency and SEDERA.
Been a message from the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment in collaboration with its social partners. If you or anyone you know is in need of help, please feel free to contact us at 440-2269. And remember, a life free from violence is possible.
establishment, they call it treason. Why should they persecute a brother for seeking black power? Don't they know a blind man could see that this is blatant hypocrisy? The real traitors and them are all high in society. Yet the government protecting all of them and penalizing you and me. And in a million different ways they violating law. It's the same good no good bastards who oppress the poor. They sell in black market, making excess profit, paying a starvation salary. These good citizens are the architects of economic slavery.
Welcome back, viewers, to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. I'm your host, Beverly Sinclair, and I have with me Dr. Patrick Antoine and Dr. Denzel Douglas. We are looking at opposition voices and how important are they to our democracy. Before we went on the break, we really did a very, very clear and practical analysis of how the system that we claim to have inherited is working in our parliaments. And we have Dr. Douglas that I'm very happy to have on this program because he has served both as Prime Minister and as leader of the opposition. And Dr. Douglas, I want to ask you, when you sat in the seat of Prime Minister, do you think, looking back on how you managed your government at the time, would you say that you gave respect to opposition parties and opposition voices as you are now explaining that they deserve?
I would say yes, of course. When I served, I definitely respected the opposition. The opposition at that time was in office for 15 years prior to my taking the seat of government. And so you would imagine that one would have had a very long period in opposition that would have taught very many lessons and which would have invigorated to a large extent how one would use the office of Prime Minister, the position of government to administer the country's affairs in a way that was conscious to the fact that there was an opposition and there was going to be a different view, different ideas, different type of commentaries with regard to how the government was functioning. One of the important areas that I strongly suffered with when I was in opposition was the access to the media. Because not only in St. Kitts and Nevis, at that time, was the government media about the only established media platform, one or two radio stations that were provided by religious bodies. There was very little opportunity for private sector persons to get involved in the media. And one of the things that I did was to free up the media, so to speak, because of the difficulties I myself had experienced when I was in opposition the first time. Definitely you could not get onto the government media. You could not, you could only basically hear yourself, see yourself, people will hear you from the government media if you're in the parliament, because of course the parliamentary debates were being covered by the government media. So one of the first thing that we did was to liberalize the media. And so I granted several licenses to radio stations so that it was possible for private sector people to air, to own media enterprises and to have access to them by the opposition persons or anyone who was within the area of within the general construct of the NGO groups, so that opposition to the government views could be easily be heard and pursued. Of course, again, the matter of allowing the opposition to flourish, that obviously took place in Parliament. There was very strong debate from both sides. One would have said that maybe the handling of a third attempt to change our boundaries might have ended in the Parliament with a different approach to bring in the end of the debate to an end. And some people felt very strongly that that did not give the opposition the opportunity to make their contribution with regard to the debate that was taking place on the the constituency boundaries changes that we were making at that time. But I think generally, having grown up in politics from within the opposition to some extent, recognize that the opposition has a very critical role to play as the government does. Today, I am very, very distraught with regard to some of the things that are happening in the Parliament today.
And before you tell us about some of those things that are happening, I want to hear Dr. Antoine weigh in on this. Dr. Antoine, from where you sit, I know you have never served in any government, although you have contributed to the drafting of many policies, many of which remain not implemented even to this day, but you have seen your fair share of governments in action across the Caribbean. Would you say that opposition MPs that are sitting in the Parliament, would you say they are given equal access to resources, that their arguments are given equal examination and weighted in the Parliament in the same way as the members of Parliament who would serve with the governing party?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. And I think Dr. Douglas has put the cat among the pigeons. And I think we need to be frank on this program, because all societies are in fact going through profound changes now, or need to go through profound changes. And let me say that what I'm about to say is for both, in the case of Grenada, both dominant parties. I've looked at the way in which both dominant parties have engaged this issue. And the answer is simply no. And I think the real nub of this is that far too often there is a blurring of the lines between party and government, so that the information that should flow in the governance system, for instance, for an opposition MP, often finds itself censored by someone using a political hat, a party hat. And so the party hat really sees things in two dimensions. You're either with us or you're against us. And that existed and has existed in Grenada for far too long. I think it's reached a position now where you do not have an opposition to speak about. You have one person one on the government slate. And so I think what we hear from, Member of Parliament Tobias is really are complaints that magnify the problem in these situations where you have one man essentially trying to speak in opposition tones for the people. But the problem really is a blurring of the lines between party and government. And where does this come from and why is it important? Well, it really matters to us because if you don't have the opposition structures, when policies are being changed, and the one I want to talk about is the premier event for the announcement of policies, the budget. If you can have a government that has absolute majority announce a budget where it holds a one-day consultation, and we understand that, and I can speak openly on this matter, when you go to the consultation, the document's pretty much complete. And what you're doing is that you're going to check a box. There is no fundamental contribution, which is why in many countries it's actually now dissolved into nothingness. It's just, an event that takes place, and some people who support the government go on, they have a good time, sandwich and juice, but there's nothing concrete coming from it in terms of policy changes or recommendations. It's all a show. Simply put, people may be upset, it's a sham. We've had a sham of this for some time, and I've raised it even when I sat with colleagues and said, look, we need to go around the country and get concrete changes. So let's follow this. If the government can now pass a budget where it uses its own metric of priorities, right, to essentially decide and determine for the entire population, what you're likely to have is a situation where the government, because there's a blurring of the party and the government lines, can in fact pass policy that aims to entrench its own power in office. And so you can have, at the time of critical need, where people are crying out for instance, a stimulus package for teachers or for public workers, or where people are crying out for increased investment in agriculture. You can have an administration that decides to put this in job creation short term because it fits with a political mandate. And unfortunately, this is happening in a number of countries in the region. It is a dangerous trend. It really feeds into when you hear our society talk about dependence. But there is really no way to break this dependence until you are able, as it were, to get the government out of power, or you are able to change the rules. And that's why I continue to pound the issue of structure. We need to reform and put structures in place that give real voice to the people on the ground, that give real voice to the groups in our society that are important, so that the government now has to hear what the people want. And then we need to put structures in place for the government to account. And that is almost absent in a lot of administrations outside of going back to the next budget. So you can't say how your tax dollar is spent, and you can't influence how your tax dollar is spent. And so I think what we have is we have a vicious cycle, which is leading, unfortunately, to a disenfranchisement of major segments of our population. And that's why I see that this is a moment of profound change for our region, because if this is not addressed, it is not going to end well. And the last thing I want to say, I think really piggybacks on what was said by Dr. Douglas. We too have experienced in Grenada, even as a public policy NGO, dealing with, of course, how do we leverage to bring pressure on the administration or input into the process from time to time. And I want to be clear, from time to time, a blackout from the press, even at our stage. So I can well imagine how it is for opposition parties, where, for instance, you have something to say that is counter or contrary. And let me say, this is not a new problem, because I've heard in a previous dispensation, the government, agents of the government stating very clearly, of course, party agents of the government, go figure, stating, don't let him talk. When they talk, they influence people. So you have this blackout taking place by agents, right, through the media. And we have to look at that. There is a very serious threat to press freedom in our country and in our community in many instances. Let me repeat, there is a serious threat to press freedom. And that's something that we have to watch.
Absolutely, and Dr. Douglas mentioned that he granted a number of licenses for media outfits to operate when, his party formed the government after 15 years in opposition. But I want to ask you, Dr. Douglas, did you distribute these licenses in a fair manner, or did you distribute these licenses to people that are known or that were known to support your party? Because it's something that I have seen in Grenada, where a lot of licenses are distributed, but they are given to party supporters.
No, really, we've not done that. In fact, most of the licenses granted were for people who were interested in really practicing their services in the media. Of course, many of them would have carried the opposition voice, because the opposition voice naturally would have been less ventilated than the government voice through the established media. But I think, no, it was not done along political partisan lines at all. We just wanted to make sure that persons who were interested in the practice of the media enterprises would have the opportunities so to do. And we did not go down that road. I think it's very, very important that we really appreciate the concerns that would have been raised by Dr. Antoine, because especially in situations where you do not have an elected parliamentary opposition, I imagine how difficult it is. And that is why, as I said earlier, to a large extent, if we are all for good governance and the practices of good governance are to help to invigorate our democracy, we definitely would want to ensure that whether we are in government or in opposition, that the best policies and programs and projects would come to the people as a result of consultation with the people. The budget exercise that he mentioned, that is something that I practiced for the time I was in government. That is not practiced today at all. I guess the government feels it's not an exercise that is important. It's an exercise in futility. So the government no longer consults with the NGO groups in the country before it would present the national budget. We have a situation today, again, speaking to the management of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the government has ruled out its vaccination program. To me, here is where the government would want to have buy-in from all stakeholders in the country, not only in terms of the government ministers, not only in terms of the opposition in the parliament, but not only in terms of celebrities in the country, but inform the ordinary man and woman and the children who are in the villages and towns. And so a program is rolled out. There has not been any proper consultation or education programs. There are no awareness programs so that at least people can give their own ideas, since the vaccination program is for the benefit of their own welfare, the welfare of the country and the welfare of the region, and also the welfare of St. Kitts and Nevis and the region as it relates to the rest of the international community. And so a program is rolled out. The opposition had to be out there saying, why is it that there is no consultation with us? Why is it we don't have the opportunity to speak to the issue of encouraging people to take the vaccine and the importance? And it smacks to a large extent on what I perceive has developed in our country, that there is a difference between ruling by power as against ruling by influence. Governing by
gentlemen,
and governing as against governing by influence and consultation and discussion.
This program is called Time to Face the Facts for a reason. Facing the facts means we have to accept responsibility and own up to our contribution to the degradation of governance in our region. It didn't happen by chance. It happens because we, as citizens of the region, implemented systems that, as Dr. Antoine said earlier, we find ourselves being ruled rather than governed. And we have to take responsibility, Dr. Douglas, for the role each and every one of us play in this. I don't want to call it a game, because it's not a game. It's people's lives we are talking about. People that have lost opportunities because of party politics. People who have been given opportunities because of party politics. And we have this thing playing out in our society that we need to take ownership of and fix. And I am happy to hear Dr. Antoine speak to a new kind of system, because Dr. Douglas, clearly the party system has not served us well. It has served members of parties well, but it has not served our countries well, because for countries, we are still young democracies. We have not been independent so long, but for where we are, And for what we have in the region, we have been underdeveloped by party politics. And we're going to take a break right here, and we will come back on this edition of Time to Face the Facts. Viewers, do stay with us.
No one should live in fear of the person they love, children included.
This is something that is really becoming an issue within our country, and we need to make necessary steps to stop it.
It seems like sexual violence against women and children has become habitual.
Abusers, Mr. Sickle, it ain't macho to get on, so I said no, I said no, I said no, nowhere.
This has been a message from the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment in collaboration with its social partners. If you or anyone you know is in need of help, please feel free to contact us at 440-2269. And remember, a life free from violence is possible.
Feel good facts.
Help prevent cold and flu by washing your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. That's the time it takes to remove most germs. No soap and water? No worries when you've got alcohol-based hand sanitizer.
Now, another suggestion which is topical and has caused some controversy is I actually think we need lifestyle audits. I was Solicitor General. I worked as Attorney General. Why should I be afraid of being checked if I didn't steal? I should be asked what I have, how I got it, and when I tell you that it's from allowances, I should prove that. If I tell you I have businesses, let me show the businesses, but I should also show what tax I paid. We must all account for the wealth we have. Otherwise, don't go into public service. I have heard some rebuttals about this lifestyle audit issue and saying everyone should then do it. We can't target people. Does everyone handle public money? Those of us who choose to enter these public offices should be open to accountability. When you are in public office, you are not a private person. There is no privacy. If you drive a Range Rover, we want to know where you got the money. Because you are in public office. If you wear a Rolex, we want to know where you got the money. Otherwise, you don't qualify to serve, and you shouldn't serve in those offices. And that would be true no matter which party came into power. You can't become a millionaire out of serving in government. How have you done it? How have you done it without abusing your position? If people want to be business people, go and do business. If you want to serve the people, serve the people.
It's funny because just a week ago I had a minister responsible for Lusaka, Honorable Bowman Nsambo. I asked him a very good question. I asked him where he's gotten all his money from. I asked him if he's involved in some form of baiting. He said, no, I do work, and the money that government gives me is enough for me to spend, in
ask him for his payslip. That payslip is public. You are a journalist, go on Bowman Nsambo and ask him for his payslip. You are entitled. He's saving you, the people. Seek for that information and check. Go and get my payslip. I can give you the payslip I was getting. I don't think I ever got anything more than 30,000 kwacha as a net salary in that office.
Probably maybe ministers get something way beyond that.
Where?
You can tell
As
us
Attorney
your-
General, I was serving in cabinet. Ask the ministers who are telling you they are being paid enough to give you their pay slips. You cannot become a millionaire from working in government. Let's be serious. We are serving people who are exchanging. Some are eating today at lunchtime, others are eating tomorrow. People are dying in this country. You know? You cannot start pillaging national resources and then you even fool the people in the manner that you are being told. There is no government salary that can make you a millionaire. There is no, you will live, yes. Okay, you can get a loan here and there. But certainly you can't become a super millionaire. That is for business people. That is why the normal government service, when I was in government, I didn't buy a brand new car. I didn't even buy a brand new car for my wife. The records are there, they can come and check. I didn't. I drove my GRZ car all 3 years. But I had been buying brand new cars before. From where I came from, out of my private business, before I ever served in government, I was buying brand new cars from the showroom. The 3 years I worked in government, I never bought a brand new car.
Welcome back to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. I am your host, Beverly Sinclair, and the fact we are looking on this evening in this program is opposition voices. How important are they to our democracy? And I have with me to explore that topic Dr. Denzel Douglas from St. Kitts Nevis and Dr. Patrick Antoine from, well, he's a Caribbean man, but we know his roots in Grenada, and that is where he extends his energy and influence and where he plans to go some places. We look to see where he goes in the future. But right now, as we continue to look at the opposition voices and the role that they play, I want to ask Dr. Antoine, you talk about, your pressure group and influencing policy. Have you seen policy being influenced from the outside by any pressure group, whether it be a union, an NGO, or any other kind of group that seeks to put pressure on government and governance? How effective have they been in changing policy?
Well, the simple truth is that there really isn't space we have found for pressure groups in our country. We had to test the ground. One mustn't just presume that that what is heard is necessarily the state of play. But we have found, certainly in the context of Grenada, that as you listen to the offerings publicly recently, there are public utterances from people stating that, look, this is a two-party country, right? Pure and simple. Yeah, either get with one or get with the other. Really, so I think that is an answer to the question, and we have found that even where there are civil society organizations, it is a form of managed democracy. Many of them have told us, for instance, on key issues, even where they have tabled their views have not been taken into account in the way that they would like, and in many instances not taken into account at all. And of course, what we've been doing is testing the ground where this is concerned. We have continued to be open in making very constructive contributions to the process in our country now, which requires everyone. And we have found that the environment really is not an environment that is geared towards complete inclusion, which we find to be rather unfortunate, particularly having regard to what was said by Dr. Douglas in facing COVID in all its various and diverse dispensations. So the short answer is that given our construct of democracy, we find there not to be space for groups of our nature, and we continue to say this is why we need to look at reforming this thing. We need to look at structures, how we build institutionals, and how we build institutions that have a place in law with the democratic process. And of course, we feel a fundamental part of that has to be local government, and it has to be a place for civil society groups like ours to influence the process and to get feedback on what our contributions have been and how they've been incorporated. That is absent.
Yes, Dr. Douglas, how would you respond, to that same question? What kind of impact have you seen these pressure groups have on influencing government decisions?
I think to a large extent, traditionally we've had the benefit of the trade union movements here in St. Kitts and Nevis as part of the, for example, traditional labor movement from which my own party had sprung back in 1932. And labor laws, to a large extent, which governed workers' rights, etc., right to work, right to receive decent wages, to ensure that the conditions of work and so forth are in place. These, over the years, traditionally have influenced policy and legislation in the government to ensure that these things are maintained. That's why, for example, today, when one hears in the Caribbean region from not only Caribbean scholars, but practitioners of good governance speak of mandatory vaccination of populations, it scares me, because it means that maybe we have not learned anything at all over the years. And that is why, therefore, I made specific mention of trade unions, because this issue of today smacks to the heart of the trade union movement in the Caribbean region. When workers are being told by governments and by private employers, encouraged by governments, that they should not be allowed to work, whether in government institutions or in private enterprises, unless they are vaccinated or unless they are tested every 2 weeks. These are serious challenges where, therefore, the voices of the NGOs and the established organizations, which are stakeholders in the development of our economies, countries, and societies, need to speak out. And I use this platform today to say that this is a very, very serious challenge to what is today our democracy, the right of choice, irrespective of the entire national good vaccinations will bring. People must have the right to choose. And people will choose rightly and correctly if they are properly informed, if they are aware, if they are educated. And where these are absent, then persons who are in power, instead of using the influence of education and awareness, etc., they simply rule and say, take it or go out to the door. These are very, very trying times for us here in the Caribbean region. And here is where I would say that the pressure groups, organizations like Dr. Antoine and so forth in the Caribbean need to speak out, even in situations where there is no voice in the parliament.
It is interesting that you mentioned the mandatory vaccination requirement for that we have heard being touted in some countries. Certainly in St. Vincent, I was appalled to hear the authorities there stipulate that people who are fleeing from a volcanic eruption would have to be vaccinated before they can enter a shelter. I mean, I thought that was just so way out and way off the chart. And as a colleague of mine says, so is the vaccination going to immunize these people against the volcanic ash or something like that? You know, that you're going to insist that they be vaccinated to get into a shelter? And that kind of excess and that kind of wielding of power brings me to ask about constitutional rule. We have constitutions which are supposed to guide us. Dr. Antoine alluded to it earlier. We have constitutions that are supposed to guide us. what role are we seeing our Constitution play? How is it being enforced? Are citizens clamoring for the Constitution to be followed by those who sit in seats of authority and in positions of leadership? Simply asking, gentlemen, where are our constitutions in all of this? Dr. Antoine.
Well, unfortunately, there was a review, I want to say perhaps in September 2020, which actually looked at the way that governments globally seemed to be setting aside the Constitution at this time. In many instances, the report indicated that in an unjustified and often in a manner that was aimed only at, let us just say, concentrating state power. And I think in many instances, we've had certainly to question whether that has been the case. And of course, in Grenada, the one that jumped out at me as Dr. Douglas spoke was when we attempted to, as it were, pass a law which would give the authorities, the police, for instance, the authority to enforce the COVID regulations in a draconian manner. And of course, we know that the government wisely considered it prudent to pull it back. I think this is the kind of mischief that we have to guard against. We also have to guard against the mischief where I think Dr. Douglas is eminently qualified to speak on this, and I've listened to him. There is a view that it is really a sort of a binary choice. You either take it or you don't, and you take it. Even if I don't give you the appropriate information, you must take it because I say so. Again, the issue of being ruled. Let me just say that in the private sector, where I've spent quite a bit of time, we've moved away from advertising and marketing, which actually talks about what we call thou shalt not and thou shalt. What we've done is that we've now worked with giving people the educational tools to come to informed choices. And we've found in all instances that this is what has worked. And of course, it's worked very well in a field Dr. Douglas knows about, in how we deal with the challenges and so on that attend to NCDs. You start giving people life skills and they start making different choices. So we're very concerned about those kinds of pronouncements. We think that even where one makes allowances for the fact that COVID brings a level of mental stress to all elements of society, that governments need to be very, very cautious about the way in which they trot, lest this becomes precedent. And of course, it continues. And let me say, certainly in Grenada, I pull no punch in saying that having come from where we have come from, we need to be particularly cautious because our population is particularly sensitive to that. So my own view is that it is really a time for us to be stewards and guardians of the Constitution first, particularly where there is no absolutely conclusive evidence that the direction that we're pointing to is a direction that cures or that cannot coexist, for instance, with another approach which would give us a better result. That's really where I'm coming from on this matter with health. So let me just say that in relation to your comment on St. Vincent, we are particularly distressed at TGM, and certainly many of us who are connected with St. Vincent and the Grenadines about the disaster. We think this is a time for us to pull together. And our own contribution to this, particularly given that St. Vincent has been a beacon of light for a lot of us in the OECS in terms of the progress it's made, is that it's a time for us all to pull together in supporting St. Vincent. And my only comment, which I want to make further on this program, is that St. Vincent has fed a lot of our community. In fact, I myself only a week ago lauded their performance on agriculture, on livestock and so on, and what they've been doing. This is an opportunity for a lot of countries, such as Grenada, such as St. Kitts and Nevis, with lots of Arab land from sugar, to step in and to assist to fill the gap that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has left. And I think the gap in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis would be the Northern Territories going up to the BVI. And in the case of Grenada, where we have tremendous fallow land and lots of young people idle, it's a time for us to step in and both assist St. Vincent and the Grenadines and assist the community by filling that breach that they've left. This is a time for us to wrap together not just to sit and say, oh my Lord, look what's happened to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but to do something about it. And that's just one proposal we want to make as TGM to the government of Grenada and to the OECS community.
I think Dr. Antoine has spoken for both of us when he alludes to the opportunities that the misfortune of the software in St. Vincent would have presented to the rest of the Caribbean region. I definitely here in St. Kitts and Nevis would welcome the opportunity of the Vincentians, especially to assist us in the continued diversification of the economy away from sugar agriculture to food crop and other forms of agriculture. This is an opportunity for us to link hands with our brothers and sisters, make strategic alliances with farmers in St. Vincent who are being displaced, so that they can have the opportunity to continue to pursue their livelihoods in agriculture from here in St. Kitts and Nevis. I believe that policies and programs over the years would have, to some extent, assisted what would have been a massive relocation of people, especially those who were in the Sophia area. Countries have come on board to assist in the evacuation, whereas before, back in 2002, 1902, when we would have had a similar eruption, we speak of 1,500 lives being lost. Today, I think if any has been lost, it's minimal. And this is because of this speedy movement and facilitation of people who were moving. And this in particular has come about as a result of putting in place, in my own situation here in St. Kitts and Nevis, with about 9 devastating hurricanes during the time I was in office, putting in place specific plans under the guise of national emergency management agencies. They may have different names in different islands, but the idea is that we have come to recognize that on an annual basis, our people are displaced because of disasters, mainly hurricanes. And so I was very proud to look at what appears to be the management of the disaster situation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines coming alive, seem to have been well structured, well organized, and to a large extent, that is fueled by NGO groups. Representatives from NGO groups, I should say, which over the years have lent their experience and their resources in strengthening the management agencies of the various disasters that we've had. And today it is almost a near perfect situation in the management of disasters in the Caribbean region. We've seen it in Dominica. We've seen it now in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We've seen it in St. Kitts and Nevis and in Antigua and so forth in the past, and in Grenada, devastating hurricanes there in Grenada. So the role of our NGOs, even though they may be speaking from the political viewpoint of opposition, play critical roles at times of emergencies and crises in particular. Why then aren't they allowed to be heard? Why aren't they, why aren't their suggestions, ideas not incorporated normally, but only in times of crises? These are some of the fundamental questions that we must ask ourselves as we look towards establishing the role and the voices of the opposition, whether in parliament or out of parliament, in the Caribbean region.
It's very interesting to hear Dr. Douglas make that remark, because just recently in Grenada, I heard one of the trade unions make a similar remark that the unions are called upon in times of crises to ask for sacrifices and various types of contributions from their members. But otherwise, it's like they serve no purpose. They're cast aside and forgotten and ignored in many ways until another crisis comes around. So it is something to bear in mind and to look at seriously at how NGOs are treated, and sometimes the way they are labeled and maligned, not aligned, maligned as a political force when they are trying to raise a voice and to speak as an opposition voice in what we call our democracies. Gentlemen, we are running out of time, so we're going to take a break, and when we get back, I want to hear from you both on an issue that for me has been really something that I've been looking at for a while. But I'm going to ask you gentlemen about it when we get back right here on this edition of Time to Face the Facts. And viewers, you're going to want to hear what this question is, and I'm sure you'll be interested in the answers they will give. So stay with us, don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back.
Men are not made to physically abuse women.
This is something that has become a serious problem in our country, or has been a serious problem in our country. Abuse could present itself in many forms. It could be physical, verbal or emotional, and the most egregious, sexual.
It's not a good look. It's not right in no form. So domestic violence against women should stop. How can you hit a woman, beat a woman?
Every form of abuse has an effect on the individual abuse, on their family members, on children, even the community as a whole.
I'm a man. I came out of a woman. I love my mother. I love my nieces. So to the children, if you're being abused, talk to somebody that you trust and get your message to the person.
This has been a message from the Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment in collaboration with its social partners. If you or anyone you know is in need of help, please feel free to contact us at 440-2269. And remember, a life free from violence is possible.
What does good governance mean? Before we can improve local government, we need to agree on what good governance is. Effectiveness. We expect government to achieve results and use resources wisely. Police patrol, trash gets picked up, and potholes are repaired without wasting money. Equity. Government policy should benefit all of us, not just the majority or elite. To promote economic, racial, and gender equity, government can support programs that consider our unique circumstances and perspectives, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. Strategic vision. Public officials should take a long-term perspective. like planning cost-effective infrastructure upgrades that improve safety and reduce traffic congestion over 20 years, rather than just focusing on today's needs. Transparency. We should be able to see why and how government makes decisions, like having access to explanations about government votes, policies, budgets, and campaign finance information. Accountability. Public officials should do what they promise, explain their decisions, and be held responsible for consequences without spinning facts. Like keeping officials accountable using budget audits, program evaluations, and ethics committees. Participation. We should all have a voice in public decisions, even if we're not well connected or don't shout the loudest. Like listening to our concerns and aspirations through voting, public meetings, and comments. Consensus orientation. Government should work with different interests to find common ground and solutions that work for everyone. Like talking with residents, police, ex-offenders, researchers, and political leaders to solve complicated issues of public safety and incarceration. Trust. We should be able to trust that our public officials are working in our best interests. For example, when government enters a contract that's not the lowest bid, we can trust that it's for a good reason, like the contractor does quality work or pays fair wages. We need to be able to trust public officials to prioritize our interests over their own. When we talk about good governance, we mean, do you agree? Would you add any others, or is one more important to you than others? What does good governance mean to you?
Welcome back to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. We are looking at opposition voices and their importance to our democracy and the functioning of our societies. My guests are Dr. Patrick Antoine and Dr. Denzel Douglas. Dr. Patrick Antoine from Grenada, Dr. Denzel Douglas from St. Kitts Nevis. Gentlemen, we have covered a lot and there is a lot more to cover. But there is a question I want to put on the table that I want to get perspectives from both of you on. The current system, we have highlighted deficiencies in the stifling and keeping out of the governance of the country of the opposition. Dr. Douglas, your country had really a quite interesting election last time, I must say. And prior to that, the election before that, we saw members of Team Unity that now forms the government campaigning up and down the Eastern Caribbean, seeking to be heard on the matter of the no confidence vote, which they said was being kept out of the parliament, and other issues. They didn't manage to get a lot of support from governing parties, but they did manage to drum up support otherwise. My question is, Dr. Douglas, would you actively participate in a dismantling of political parties and allowing citizens to vote for individuals to serve in the parliament rather than to vote along party lines? Is that something you would actively support and participate in?
Well, of course, I should say from the outset that this possibly is one of the reformed structures that can emerge, especially based on what Dr. Antoine has been saying for the moments ago, that there is need for some form of reform, some form of revisiting of structures so that the voices of the people can be heard, not necessarily people in opposition or people in government, but the voices of the people confined expressions within the society. Whatever structure, whatever form, brings greater opportunities for people, those citizens and residents who have the right to vote, whatever structure can give greater opportunity for them to express their desire for change or continuing with situations, I am for that. To say that we would want to dismantle the present system, I don't think that it is something that can be dismantled overnight. Maybe in revolutionary settings that can be done quite quickly. But in situations where we have seen in democratic states, in institutions, in democratic societies where there are entrenched institutions that are built around the current system, it would really need a different type of construct and structure if we are going to get to that stage. But as I said from the beginning, whatever structure or form gives greater support to one's freedom of choice with regard to those who should be in the seat of governance, I, Denzel Douglas, will be for that.
And how do you feel about that sort of dismantling and reshaping, Dr. Antoine?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult in the first instance. I think it is certainly a vision and a goal for us to strive to. And you know, the way that I use vision is that if it was something that was easily attained, then it wasn't worth pursuing. So I think we ought to look there at how we really democratize the thing. But in the short to medium term, there are some things we can do. One of the things we can do immediately, I believe, is that we need to reform the rules and regulations around which the elections take place. And one of the things I think I want to see is campaign financing reform. I think it's so important for us to have that, particularly in small states, that is certainly something I think we can do in the short run. And let all ideas contend, yes, is where I think we need to go with that. That's one thing. The second thing is I think very quickly we will find a consensus to amend a number of the processes, which does not mean touching the Constitution, to give effect to some of the things we've spoken about on this program. For instance, what are the steps and the consultation process that needs to be followed prior to policy being passed by the government, particularly in the context of budgets, mini budgets, and changes to the budgets, yes? Those are things that we can do. And let me tell you that I believe a lot of that momentum will come from the court. The CCJ, in a number of its recent rulings, have been focusing heavily on the process which gives effect to Article 26 of the treaty, which talks for consultations at the national and regional level. And it's insisting that it is not the outcome that matters most. It's really the process that you would have gone through. It's really whether you would have pre-announced, whether you would have given facility and an opportunity for people having alternative views to essentially voice them. And also whether you have done the analysis and so on around that. And the analysis doesn't just mean economics. It means social impact. It means environmental impact. It says that, look, if you're going to build a hotel and you have a community that's going to be affected, that you can't willy-nilly decide that you're going to essentially go ahead and have them do it, right? And I think what we want here is that we want to see these reforms take place in the short run. It can be done. But I think ultimately we're looking at some kind of change that may be foisted upon us by dint of the decisions of the court. Because I think that if this is pressed to its legitimate end, we could have some decisions coming from someone who challenges this as being an undermining of some of their fundamental rights. And I think that's certainly something we need to look at. So there's some short-term things we need to do. We need to make sure too that we put legislation in place that protects the press. That's tremendously important. So I think I want to call these the short-term workarounds that are practical now. I do, like Dr. Douglas, believe that the other thing really is a long-term goal. But I want to say that the way that we can start achieving that, Dr. Douglas, is if we were to take that that desire of having people vote for individuals and not parties, we could create a local government structure that exists within the existing structure that gives articulation. And I really love that idea very much, Beverly, because I think if we are able to do that, then we can have people with campaign reform and with the ability to vote for individuals based on their competence, not as part of a party slate, give voice to their own demands, desires, their needs, and their imperatives from their community. And that's where I think we can do this in the short to medium term. So yes, the answer is that's a very profound question. These are the steps I see to getting towards it.
Absolutely. Now, gentlemen, I want to ask you, is there anything that we have not yet discussed which you would like to discuss, that you could raise it, put it on the table now, because we're running out of time and we're very soon going to have to wrap this program? What comes to mind that you would like to talk about?
What comes to mind for me in particular is working seriously towards attaining a consultative type of democracy.
Absolutely.
That being the form of government that we can aim for, and doing a number of things, as Dr. Antoine said, which can be implemented now to attain that. I mean, we find it very difficult in situations where a government chooses to maybe pay $43 million in a pay for peace initiative among restless young guys. And there are serious issues of severance payments to thousands of workers displaced as a result of COVID-19 that has remained untouched. These are because I think the government we are not consulting enough with groups out there who have priority ideas, who feel very strongly that if they are to be governed properly, we who are in the seat of parliament and government and opposition, we need to listen more to them. These are some of the things that can be attained as we move towards what you raised a moment ago, voting for people rather than for parties.
Dr. Antoine?
Institutions and structures, we need to create them. We need to create these institutions and structures that would cause the voice of the people to manifest itself in the key decisions of the government of the day. This is particularly important at this time, where we are in fact in the throes of a tremendous, unprecedented crisis, requiring all hands on deck. Unfortunately, the actions of our government in Grenada, from time to time, leaves a lot to be desired. It would have been great if we could have addressed and approached the challenges of COVID as a cohesive society. Think how powerful it would be if this model was followed in all the countries, and we could approach the international finance community as governments and oppositions in all its dispensations together as one united civilization, requesting that we get the type of financial package necessary to transform and transition our country having regard to this unprecedented crisis. We simply need to start understanding that these good practices begin at home. And if we're able to create those, if we're able to create the momentum, the structure, the consensus at home, by speaking to each other, by engaging each other more, and without the usual conflict that we descend into, I think our society in Grenada and our civilization in the OECS would be all the better for it. And of course, in this regard, we unapologetically say that we support the public workers in their struggle for their 4% in Grenada. We unapologetically say that there's a voice for civil society like ours, where we said that the choice around the airport loan was a bad choice in the way in which it was pursued. We believe that, for instance, part of that loan could have been taken to do the critical things, but it was not a good decision. And this is why we announced that in a few months, the airport workers would be, as it were, sent home, that many of them could not be sustained on the payroll of the Grenada Airport Authority. And so it has come to roost. We believe that we have a part to play. We are prepared to play that part. We are here to be constructive. After all, this country of ours, Grenada, this OECS civilization belongs to all of us. Thank you.
And thank you both, gentlemen. I want to add to that these new systems that we talk about, I would love to see them implemented. You know, we know it can't be done at the flick of a switch, but certainly if there is the political will and if there are the right people in positions of leadership, we've seen a lot of square pegs in round holes over the years, as we say in the colloquial sense. And we would like to see the system of meritocracy, where people are given positions based on their ability to perform in those positions. And in fact, where they are removed from those positions, if for any reason they are unable to perform, because the development of the country is supposed to be paramount. And I have seen a system that forces people to remain in poverty. And I make no apologies when I say sometimes I think this system is enforced so that we can go out and beg and get money easier than looking at our own development. When we remain poor countries, you know, there are certain benefits to being a poor country, but we need to get our minds and our mentality out of that, so that our people can aspire to greater things. We're a great region, you know, there is so much talent and so much resource, so many resources in the region. We do not need to be poor. We do not need to be out there begging, but we need the right people in the right positions to take the region in the direction that it can go. And we're looking to people like Dr. Antoine, who's coming with fresh new ideas from a brand new position. And Dr. Douglas, if you are looking to once again sit at the reins in your country, I would expect that you would come with some different ideas and a different approach to what has happened in the past. I would love for you to respond to that before I actually wrap.
Well, of course, I think, as I said, what is happening now is consultation at the national level with regard to some of the fundamental changes that are being made in the St. Kitts Nevis Labour Party. And to a large extent, it's bringing opportunity to young people and people across the broad spectrum of society, bringing them the opportunity to express, to give ideas, to ensure that their voices are to be heard within the party structure as it rolls out for its future mandate that it is seeking from the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. And I'm sure that at the end of the day, after this widespread consultation would have been attained and the necessary assessment be made of the material, we would be in a position in St. Kitts and Nevis to end the coalition that is in existence today and move our country back under the consultative management with the Labour Party as its leader and others making their contributions inside or outside of the parliament. We look forward to that opportunity.
During the last election,
Beverly, I was just going to say to him quickly, if you take that part about the coalition out, because we don't want to be accused of interference.
Oh, well, of course.
What Dr. Douglas said is spot on. And yes. I just wanted to say that where two minds agree, clearly only he needs to speak because only one is necessary. The idea on youth, spot on. Please, go ahead.
Right, and that is where my question is going. During the last election campaign, we saw Dr. Douglas's party pushing the next generation. You know, they had a Labour Party, Next Gen. So is this an indication, Dr. Douglas, that we know the party system won't come to an end by the next election? But is this an indication that you are ready and at the point to turn over that top spot in the party to one of the younger generation so that we can usher in maybe a youth prime minister in St. Kitts if the party should be successful at the next polls?
I know this is a youth prime minister. Why not a female prime minister? That is also very possible.
Well, youth could be female, but
of course, the party, as I said, is just about at the end of completing its consultative exercises. We do have what is called a National Leadership Transition Council that has finalized its work. It has presented to the National Executive of the party its recommendations. And although the recommendations are that any elected member of the party can remain in office for any time until he wishes to resign or until the party removes that person, I believe, would have seen my last election as the leader of the party in 2020, June last year.
Okay, well, we will remember that, because I know I've heard those words before from some people who are still there.
So that is what my intention is, I would say.
Right, so you see, it's an intention. So we will look to see if that intention will in fact become reality when the time rolls around. Personally, I believe that some of these prime ministers have just been there too long. They need to go, you know, they really need to go. But thank you, gentlemen. Thank you kindly for participating.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yes, I certainly think this conversation has been quite enlightening and quite useful. And I believe we need to have more conversations like these as we look towards systems that can work for us in our small states, systems that will engender good governance, transparency, systems that will hold those in positions of leadership and authority to account to the people. We have elections because we elect people to serve and to represent. Clearly and obviously, everyone cannot sit in the parliament. So we elect a cohort to look after our business. And that is that's all we ask. Look after our business and not yours. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, viewers, for staying with us. And we look forward to having your company next time when the next edition of Time to Face the Facts is aired. So long.
And in a million different ways they violated law.
I do have a passion for social justice, and it comes from my experience as a child. I grew up in South Africa at the time when it was divided, and it was quite an ugly world, black and white against each other, and class struggles, which I was involved in. And I got a sense as young as I was that for South Africa to be a peaceful country, we need a country where the laws are inclusive and everyone's potential is freed and everyone's life is improved by the fact that they're a member of our society. Well, I'll defend the Constitution, not necessarily because I was one of the writers. I honestly, truly believe that we have one of the best constitutional frameworks in the world. Firstly, it defines clearly the vision of society, and as I've indicated earlier, one of the things is the promise of a freed potential of every person and improved quality of life of every person. But it also defines the character of the state that will deliver that society. It talks about a state that is accountable, that is transparent, based on the rule of law and the supremacy of the Constitution. It provides for ethical governance. It even provides for giving priority to constitutional responsibilities, and ultimately then provides for structures that will deliver this constitutional dream. And among those structures, the drafters of our constitution added innovative additional structures for oversight, and those include the Puppet Act. If there are problems in our road to constitutional democracy, it is because of what President Nelson Mandela once said: even the most benevolent of governments have within them propensities for human failings. I'm not suggesting, though, that we should make excuses for people who have become selfish and gluttonous in the way they do the work. I'm just saying that was anticipated. Hence, the architecture of our democracy includes multiple oversight agencies. In South Africa, interestingly, we have had some reduction of some inequality between black and white. In other words, some of us black people have been lifted into the middle class. We own property, and although we may be one paycheck away from poverty, but we live fairly good lives. But in that process, there's lots of people that are left behind. And as I said earlier, as long as there is injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. And certainly, as social injustice increases, the world cannot expect peace. In Africa, we have a concept called Ubuntu. I am because you are. And it's really was always about humanity coexisting peacefully. And Ubuntu is really, the essence of Ubuntu is that if I improve your fortunes, mine will be improved. The survival of a community is guaranteed by each member making sure that the other person or their neighbor or the person next to them is protected. Group survival protects individual survival. Corruption is a threat to everything good in society. It undermines good governance, it undermines social justice, it undermines peaceful coexistence, because one of the things that corruption undermines is good governance. And when governance fails, things fall apart. And corruption has really created dysfunctional states because it distorts policy. But the worst thing it does insofar as social justice is concerned is that it siphons societal resources into individual pockets. And the resources that should be available to advance development and collective prosperity are taken away, and which creates a problem. Can we solve corruption? I honestly believe yes, we can. I believe in South Africa, for example, there's a sense that we are very corrupt and corruption is getting out of hand. I don't think so. I think the creation of institutions such as the Pub Protector in South Africa has not only highlighted corruption as a problem, but has galvanized society to push back against corruption. Because institutions such as the Pub Protector are not like courts, they supplement courts. They don't just solve the problem in a manner where society, I would say, basically society outsources democracy to these institutions. With the Pub Protector, society does not outsource accountability to the Pub Protector. It works with the Pub Protector. Now, we've seen in South Africa, and I've seen in Africa, though, in other African countries, people participating in these pushbacks against corruption. But it's not just in Africa. When we were in Malaysia, there was a big pushback there against corruption. And when I was in Malaysia, also one journalist approached me about what was happening in Turkey about corruption. They even called it Nkandla, because in South Africa we had heard Nkandla. Southern America, there's been a pushback against corruption. But what's the answer for me? Connecting the dots. Historically, when we dealt with corruption, there was civil society there, the media there, parliaments there, the executive, internal executive structures, the courts. But not having a united movement against corruption. In South Africa, we've decided that we'll deal with corruption exactly the same way as we dealt with apartheid. Have a united front against it and connect the dots among the leaders in society that are dealing with these issues of corruption in different institutions and in different formations. The truth is, globalization is inevitable. It's out of our hands. I think the question is, how do we handle it? I get a sense that what went wrong in globalization, just from where I'm sitting, are two things. One is global governance. And I've raised this at various fora where I've given a speech, including the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, is when the good guys also do wrong things and justify them, it becomes difficult to hold the bad guys accountable. The second thing that I think went wrong with globalization is the benefits of globalization. It seems to me that the richest got super rich, obscenely rich through globalization. But at the end of the day, each country had its own left behinds. And a lot of those left behind people were not even being catered for by those we refer to as either liberals or the left. Everyone seemed to care for the middle most of the time. So your unemployed, your blue-collar workers eventually found themselves not being taken care of properly, and a lot of them are now gravitating to the right. That's scapegoating, where some of the leaders who want to be elected harvest the despair of the poor, the anger of the poor, and then they scapegoat. You say, you are poor because there are foreigners. In South Africa, you are poor because white people are like that. But at the end of the day, the reality is we need to find a way to make prosperity work for most of us without necessarily going socialist or communist. We need to find a way to make sure that there aren't people that are left behind and that the gap between the rich and poor does not keep widening or is not obscene. I honestly think when people ask people, do you believe in democracy, they have to firstly define what kind of democracy are they talking about. Because in South Africa, for example, when politicians blame democracy and say people go to court and they go to the public protector because they fear democracy, it's people who have an antiquated notion of democracy. As democracy is the winner takes it all, majoritarian, and parliament is supreme. In South Africa, we adopted a different kind of democracy. It's constitutional democracy, meaning if democracy is about a constant dialogue between the people and those they've entrusted with public power and resources, then in South Africa, we've created multiple ways of people engaging with those they've entrusted with public power and resources. For people to then not to despair and reject democracy, we need to go back to the people to remind them that that old democracy that gives power to 1 million, for example, people who are members of a majority party is not the democracy we have in South Africa. We have a democracy in South Africa where, yes, you can engage through your political party structures, but understanding the complexity of a modern state, we've created a more complex democracy that allows you to engage through the media, through petitions, directly with politicians, through the courts, and through the public protector. As far as I'm concerned, all of that is part of democracy, but that's modern democracy. But there's nothing wrong with rethinking democracy. The democracy ideas we have were created by people who kept thinking about how do we live together in society? How do we regulate living together in a manner where none of us cheats and none of us is left behind? And there's nothing wrong with rethinking ways. But the notion of democracy for me is ideal, but how we keep working with it and expanding it as society grows is an unlimited process.